So today we're going to talk about the FAA's Remote ID Rule for drones. And I have a special treat for you. We have Kevin Morris with the FAA here. He's going to break it all down for us. So let's go. Hey guys, thanks for stopping by. Always appreciate it. It's good to see you. If this is your first time here, my name is Keith and this is Alien Drones. I do mostly drone tech, photography, tips and tutorials, and industry news. And if that's something that's of interest to you, you may want to hit the subscribe button now. That'll let you know when there's something new that might be of interest to you. So you may recall when the Remote ID Rule came out that I did do a review on it. I went through the 500 pages into the wee hours of the morning. And I'll put that video up here so that you can browse through that, because that in combination with what we're doing today will be very helpful to you. I went through a lot of details, went through all the different sections. But today we're going to be talking with Kevin Morris from the FAA, who's going to give us his first-hand explanation of some of the details of this rule rather than me interpreting it. So we always do appreciate having first-hand information. So I'd like to introduce Kevin to you. Kevin came to us recently on this channel. We did an interview about the Flights Over People rule, and again I'll put that one up here as well so you can view that, because that's an important rule as well. So as I mentioned, we are very fortunate to have Kevin with us here again today. Kevin comes to us from the FAA's Office of Communications, and Kevin is a digital communication strategist and the Unmanned Aircraft System Coordinator. So thank you, Kevin. We really do appreciate you agreeing to take some more time with us today and talk about remote ID.
Thank you, Keith, for having me once again. It's great to be back. And I tell you what, if you're not careful, this might end up becoming a series on your channel.
You know, and that wouldn't be all bad. I would welcome that. So you be careful what you wish for. You might just get it.
Right.
And of course, Kevin is back by popular demand, as he mentioned. And I have all the ladies that keep asking me for his phone number, and I promise I won't forward it. But of course, so Kevin is going to set us straight on the remote ID rule. And of course, as I mentioned, I did do a video before, and I'll link that one up here because it has some more information when I initially went through it. But of course, we're going to clarify all that now. So let's just talk about remote ID a bit and kind of dig into the details. But first of all, one of the interesting things about this when we started talking about doing the remote ID is I get comments all the time on the channel. And one of the comments I just received a little while ago, and it was just a one-sentence comment, and it said, you know, I just bought a drone. What is remote ID? You know, what is this? And it dawns on me that once in a while we get so involved with the industry, those that are really involved don't really think about those people that go to Best Buy, you know, pick up a drone, take it out in the backyard and read the instructions a little bit, and, you know, off they go. And so when they start looking around the internet and start to view things and see what rules are and such, and they come across something like this, we have to keep that in mind that some people don't even know what we're talking about. So probably a good way to start would be we'll just talk about what remote ID is a little bit, and then why the FAA decided to bring it in the first place.
Sure. And Keith, it's interesting you bring that up, because that really is, I think, both for what you do on your channel and certainly what we try to do at the FAA, the people that walk into an electronics store and purchase a drone and go home and fly it, that's the group that we need to get most of the information to in the best way possible. And so doing events like this is great for helping those people out. And I'll tell you what, if you thought you got a lot of comments on your video that we did on Ops Over People, just wait until you post this one here on Remote ID. That tends to polarize quite a few people. But you did ask a question, so let me start with answering your question. So what is remote ID? Why did the FAA think we need this? Well, simply put, remote ID is like a digital license plate. If you think of a license plate on a car, it's attached to the vehicle. You can usually see the vehicle, so you know where it is, where it's going, and it's got some information on there. Depending on the state, it might have a state license plate, but it provides you with some connection to that car if you were to go look up that number. The remote ID does something similar to that. However, it doesn't share any personal information. So remote ID, I'll tell you what it's not going to do first. So remote ID is not going to share your name. It's not going to share your drone's registration number. It's not going to share where you live. What it does do, though, is provide a serial number for that particular flight that if you're within a reception range of the remote ID broadcast system, you could pick up certain elements and information about that particular flight, keeping in mind it won't give out your name or address or registration number or anything like that, but it will share certain information like altitude, speed, those types of things. And it's important that we move forward here with remote ID because this is the next step in the evolution of drones and how we integrate them completely into our national airspace system. So things like people have been asking for a long time, beyond visual line of sight. In order to get to somewhere where we normalize beyond visual line of sight, or BV loss, as a lot of people refer to it as, that type of flying, we have to have something where we know where drones are and we can manage them almost like an air traffic system. But we need to be aware of where these drones are flying, where they're operating from, the routes that they're taking, so that we can enable future enhancements that are coming up, like beyond visual line of sight. And certainly there's the security element as well. It really helps law enforcement and FAA people know where drones are. Maybe if they're flying somewhere where they're not supposed to be, it can help law enforcement do their duty and investigate where that drone is being flown and who is flying that drone, and potentially stop a situation that would maybe end up being unfortunate.
That's a great overview. I appreciate that. And it's pretty detailed. Of course, I mentioned the whole rule is 500 pages about. So I'm assuming this wasn't created overnight by, three guys in a basement drinking a beer and decide, let's make this happen, and let's include this information, or let's how we're going to deal with this. I'm assuming there was quite a process involved. So how did you go to the industry, or what happened to where you ended up where the rule is today then? What was the process?
Yeah, that's a really good question too. Rulemaking is a massive undertaking. It's not something that's done on a whim or by three people in a basement somewhere. And contrary to what some people might think, it's not something we really enjoy or look forward to doing as well. We don't wake up in the morning thinking, hey, let's go make some new rules on drones. Typically, this comes through a variety of reasons as to why we need to do something like remote ID, just as it were for operations over people, or when we change the rule for flying at night. But when we develop a rule like remote ID, it's years in the process. And that's not because, you can insert your jokes about the government being slow or inefficient here, but the reality is it's very complex, and it involves a lot of different entities and organizations and communities and participation. So typically what happens is after a rule is developed to a stage where we call a proposed rule, it goes out for public comment. And remote ID was no different. So remote ID falls under Part 89 of our federal aviation regulations, like Part 107 or something similar to that. When we publish that rule, it goes out for public comment. And that public comment period, I can't recall exactly how long it was open, but it was a decent amount of time. Well, let me just put it this way. It was enough time to get over 53,000 comments from the public. I'm sure, Keith, you were probably one of those people that put a comment in on the remote ID notice of proposed rulemaking, along with 52,999 other people that had some thoughts about it. And what's really neat is that when we put out a proposed rule like that and the public comments start rolling in, we cannot ignore any of them. So every single comment that is submitted is read by somebody at the FAA on the rulemaking team assigned to that project. So nothing gets ignored. Now, certainly there are some comments that are, shall I say, a little bit more directive on maybe where the FAA should go. But a lot of the comments were very constructive and helped us formulate that rule. And I think the biggest example of that is the change from what we proposed, which was a network requirement. Your drone had to connect to a cell tower or some other Wi-Fi hotspot. That was eliminated, and it was eliminated because of those 53,000 plus comments. So when the FAA does come up with rules and we do publish them for public comment, it's imperative that people participate, because you absolutely can change how that rule is going to look. Now, did everybody get everything they wanted? No, but I think the biggest concerns were really addressed, and we made some big changes based on those comments.
Excellent. So we've got all the comments. We've got the rules laid out now, kind of all defined. And I'm assuming that's in effect now, because that was the rule is now we're coming up with some of the technology to finalize it. However, the rule is actually in effect as of today, or today as we speak. But there's a lot of drones that are out there right now that are existing. I have quite a few that don't have this remote ID. They're not broadcasting because they're just older technology. So before we get into the details of what's broadcasting and all the details of what's required, what if we have an existing UAV? What are we supposed to do with them? Are they be discarded? The rules in effect today. Do I have to throw that away or put it on a shelf and then wait to buy a new one that's all equipped, or what do I do with those?
Yeah. One of the things you touched on here is a word effective when it comes to the rule. And yes, the rule is in effect today, but it's really important to remember that there are trigger dates in that rule. So you can fly a drone today without any sort of remote ID component on it at all and be perfectly legal for you to do so. The first compliance date, so I want to separate those two terms. So we have the effective date, which means the rule is in effect. But the first date where things need to start operating in compliance with the rule is September of 2022. So next September, a year from now. And that's only for when manufacturers of drones that are going to be operated in the US are required to build in what we call standard remote ID technology. And then it's going to be a year after that. So September of 2023, when operators like you, myself, would actually need to sort of comply, if you will, with that rule. Now, how we do that is a couple different ways. So I'm going to go to your next question was, what if you have a drone now? What happens to that drone? Does it become an expensive paperweight? Do I got to throw it away? So the short answer is no. You'll still be able to fly that drone. There'll be a couple options for you as we move forward towards these compliance dates with remote ID. The first option is going to be something we call a remote ID broadcast module. So that's going to be an aftermarket device that can be added to your drone that complies with remote ID, therefore making your drone remote ID compliant. The other option you're going to have is operate at, and this is a little bit of a misnomer here, but we call it an FAA recognized identification area, which is a lot of words to describe a location where you can fly a drone without any remote ID. And that came back through a lot of the public comments in the rule too. You have a lot of people flying drones or legacy, let's say we call them legacy now, remote controlled aircraft, RC aircraft, that they don't want to put a big broadcast module or even a little broadcast module on their device because let's say it's a scale mock-up of a World War II fighter plane and they don't want to mark it up with different things. We're going to allow certain locations across the country to be remote ID free, if you will. And we're calling those FAA recognized identification areas. Again, it's a little bit hard to make that connection in your mind, but those are going to be areas where you can go fly and you don't need to have remote ID. So that is coming, and those areas will be identified as the applications for those areas come in prior to September of 2023. So people will have two options for drones or RC-controlled aircraft that exist today when remote ID compliance is required in 2023.
So something you mentioned there, you talked about some planes and some historical or some existing technology planes and things. And I get this question a lot because we kind of use the word drones as in place of a lot of things. And I get many comments. People say, well, you drone guys, that's for you. I have a helicopter, I have a biplane model, a scale model. It doesn't apply to this. So can you just briefly speak to that? Is it any of those models? And is it for, the second part would be, is it for any weight and size? Is there a restriction on that?
Yeah, so only if you could have gone back in time and been involved with the conversations we had about how we're going to reference RC-controlled aircraft and unmanned aircraft systems and remotely piloted aircraft systems and drones and what term we decided to use. But I'm glad you asked that because we use the term drones to encompass all unmanned aircraft. So that's anything from the balsa wood aircraft you build in your basement that you fly with remote control to the products you can buy off the shelf to some of the home built ones that a lot of people make. So when we use that term drone, we're using that to encompass all of those types of activities. And I completely understand. I know there's a large group of RC controlled airplane flyers out there that don't want to be lumped in with drones because there's a perception or public idea of what they are. And I understand that, but from a communication standpoint, we try to communicate that way so everybody's sort of on the same playing field. We don't have to say, well, this is for drones and this is for remote controlled aircraft, because in the end, it's all the same. And so we sort of stick with the term drones. But how it relates to remote ID is whether or not you actually need to comply with remote ID rule. So the rule itself makes one exception for drones. Again, keeping in mind, I'm talking about all sorts of remotely piloted aircraft or remote controlled aircraft. And that is for recreational flyers under section 44809 with drones that weigh 0.55 pounds or less. And you might be thinking, gee, Mr. FAA drone guy, that sounds like a very familiar requirement. Where does that relate to? And I'll say, aha, you're very smart and very astute, and that is a registration requirement. So remote ID is directly tied to the registration requirement, which means under Part 107, all drones will need to comply with remote ID. And under Section 44809, all drones weighing more than 0.55 pounds will need to comply with remote ID. And the reason that that weight limit is in there for just the recreational flying side is because it's tied to registration.
So something to clarify with that then is, because it's tied to registration and the registration is tied to the weight, it's not specifically then tied to either a recreational flyer or a Part 107. It applies equally to both of those with regard to weight and registration, right?
That is absolutely correct. Yeah. So remote ID is the standard. We're going to be the standard for equipment required for drones, making that one exception for the recreational flyers, because those particular drones that we talked about, 0.55 pounds or less, under Section 44809, do not need to be registered. So if your drone does not need to be registered, you do not need to comply with remote ID.
Okay, that makes sense. So to build on that just a little bit more, by the nature of the rule, asking for remote ID to be able to transmit and be received by somebody, there's an expectation by the rule that says somebody should be able to receive this information somewhere. So that being the case, if it's the expectation is to have that available to the public and or law enforcement and anybody, I remember when I was going through the comments that there was a lot of comments, and myself one of them, where I was concerned about having that transmission publicly received by just anybody in the public, whether it's a phone or if you have to buy some little scanner or something, whatever that is, and somebody being able to track where you are standing or the location of the remote from where you took off. And I know there was some concerns with some law enforcement saying that they were concerned that it could, reduce safety if somebody's somewhere and somebody wants to find out where an operator of a drone is standing, that they could scan this and say, oh, there's the drone. I see one in the sky by the beach, and look at that guy's around the corner. And they could then, make them less safe by knowing somebody wants to go steal a drone. So why was the decision made, or what was the reasoning behind kind of two things, being able to have the remote identified where it is location-wise, and potentially having that information available to the public instead of just like law enforcement, for instance, or FAA or something like that?
Right. And that's a concern that I've also heard a number of times as well through various channels. I have a lot of friends that fly drones for a living, and they've voiced these concerns. So I'll say first and foremost, we hear you. We hear that feedback. We hear that concern. One of the things I want to point out right away is that the information about you personally, the name, and I know we talked about this at the beginning, but your name, your address, the drone's registration number, that's not available to the public. And there is no way for anyone in the public to find out that information. The only way that that information can be discovered is if FAA personnel need it because it's in our database, or law enforcement personnel need it, and then they have to go through their law enforcement assistant program personnel. We call our LEAP, but they're kind of our connection between the FAA and law enforcement. They go through their LEAP agents to find out that information. The drone registration, tying it to a name and an address, is not publicly available information. So that part is protected. But let's go back to maybe what your main concern was. Not so much people might know it's Keith, but maybe they know where Keith is standing flying the drone. One of the things we do in aviation a lot is accountability. And we have to accept certain things when we're operating aircraft in a shared resource, such as the National Airspace System. And part of that is an acceptance of people are going to know what I'm doing and where I am. ADS-B is a big portion of that. Even in areas where we don't have ADS-B, radar is tracking a lot of aircraft. So drones are really just, in a way, coming in line with a lot of that. However, hearing you loud and clear and others that, well, it's difficult to get to a pilot flying in an airplane if you have a problem. It's really easy to get to a drone person. And I completely understand that. And so what I'm trying to do is, first and foremost, I should say what we as the FAA are trying to do is educate. And not so much educate you as the operator, but educate the public as a community on what drones are doing, the good work that drones are doing. Because while, yes, there might be some drone pilots out there not doing things the way they ought to be doing, the overwhelming majority of drone pilots are doing it right. They're flying safely. They're doing everything they're supposed to be doing. And drones have become such a critical and important tool as part of our nation's infrastructure in terms of how we monitor bridges, how we do search and rescue, coming up, how we do package delivery. And somewhere down the road, it's going to be how we do advanced air mobility, where you tap in a thing and a company shows up and you hop in a drone and away it goes. Right? So what our goal is to educate the public and gain the acceptance first, because most of the time when we see these incidents where drone operators are being accosted or in some terrible cases, maybe being assaulted, it's a result of not knowing what the drone is doing, because people will immediately go to, it's spying on me, and my privacy is being violated. And while the FAA doesn't get into the privacy argument, we don't regulate that, we can certainly get into the education side of it and say, hey, look, these drones are doing a lot of good things. They're doing roof inspections after storms move through. They're doing damage inspection after natural disasters roll through. And so if we can get more of that education out, that should reduce the number of incidents that we're seeing. And as drones become more and more accepted as a whole, we should see those numbers go down as well. But in terms of eliminating the broadcast element, where it's to say, well, we're not going to tell you where the control station is, or we're not going to tell you where it's taken off from, that element did stay in the rule, even though people did have comments on that. And the reasons are in that big, long 500-page document that you cite. But it really does boil down to security. And we have to have a way to be able to identify where this drone is from. And I'll end my spiel here with one example. The Minnesota Twins baseball game last year had a drone fly over and into the stadium, and they had to stop the baseball game. And it was very difficult to find out where that drone had been operating from, where the control station was, and law enforcement had a lot of difficulty finding that person. They eventually did. But with remote ID, that event becomes almost a non-event, because they're going to find that person relatively quickly.
Understood. So that was a super amount of information here, and I think I'm going to kind of head it off here. But is there anything else that you want to add just in general about either the remote ID or anything else that you want to talk with the viewers about a little bit, or anything before we part ways today?
Yeah, I appreciate the time again, Keith. This is great. I love these conversations. Being able to speak to you and your followers, I think, really does help clear up a lot of confusion. And I would say to anybody that's following your channel or listening, if you have questions, we're here to answer them. We are not a government agency that's unreachable and untouchable. It's very easy to get a hold of us. You can do that either through email or following us on our social media accounts and sending us a message. You could email us at socialmedia@faa.gov, and we can get you connected with the people in the FAA that you really need to talk to so that you can get the right answers. So if you ever hear something out there and it just doesn't seem right, or you're wondering, why would the FAA ever do that? Don't sit and wonder, and don't go on message boards trying to figure it out. Reach out to us. In a lot of cases, I'll be the one responding. So by any means, just go ahead and give us a call, send us an email. We have a UAS support center that works round the clock to answer questions at uashelp@faa.gov. They're a fantastic group of people. And then we also have the FAA safety team with their Drone Pro program. We have a lot of people that are dedicated, that volunteer their time to work with local communities. So there's a whole network of help and resources available. So reach out, use those resources. Everything I just mentioned is completely free for anybody here in the United States to take advantage of, and I recommend they do so.
Excellent. And I can vouch for that. I've reached out many times, obviously, having you on, and I've reached out to the UAV Support Center. Great group of people, a lot of information there as well. So certainly, I agree with you completely. Reach out. The FAA has been very accessible in my experience so far as well. So with that, I think we're going to call this one good. And again, I really do appreciate your time, Kevin, and I do look forward to our next visit in our upcoming series of FAA information. And certainly, I really do look forward to it and appreciate your time.
All right. Thank you, Keith. Pleasure as always.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Pleasure's mine. So that was Kevin Morris with the FAA's Communication Center. And I really do enjoy talking with Kevin over different rules from the FAA. And again, we do plan on having more of these types of sessions to get the information straight to you guys. So to that end, I would ask that you leave your comments below. I really do appreciate it. Let me know if there's questions you still have or things that you liked or didn't like about the remote ID rule. And of course, if you have items that you'd like us to discuss in the future, maybe we'll have Kevin back again and talk about those. So make sure you leave those items in the comments as well, and maybe we'll get those on a future episode. And as always, from me to you, I do appreciate your time that you take to watch these types of videos. I hope they're helpful to you. If so, if you learned something new or enjoyed the content, please hit the like below. That lets YouTube's algorithm know that we're doing something useful, and that's always appreciated. And lastly, of course, make sure you subscribe if you're not already, because I do plan on doing more interviews like this with the FAA. So that way you'll be notified if something comes up that might be of interest to you. So with that, again, thank you for stopping by. I do appreciate it. And until next time and next video, good flying.